We have Ingrid Neumann here on deck. Ingrid is a PhD in energy efficiency. She has a PhD, is the energy efficiency analysis lead specialist in the Energy Assessments Division of the California Energy Commission. She has contributed to the development of the Fuel Substitution Scenario Analysis Tool, FSSAT, as part of the technical team working on the soon-to-be published AB3232 assessment. Besides this work, the bulk of which was assessing the technical potential of electrification, Ingrid also analyzes energy efficiency savings for inclusion in the CEC's SB350 tracking efforts, as well as the California electricity and gas demand forecast. Previously, within the Building Standards Office of the Efficiency Division, she functioned as the local ordinance program lead. During her tenure, numerous energy efficiency and solar ordinances were approved, and much of the groundwork was laid towards the decarbonization ordinances that have been coming to fruition recently. Ingrid, you're a hero. Are you there with us? I see your name. Can you unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you for the wonderful introduction.
Thanks for being here, Ingrid.
All right, so I believe I ought to be able to share my screen now. Let's see if we can do this.
1 year into the quarantine, almost everyone can do a Zoom.
Right. It should be possible.
It's there, we see it. Take it away.
All right, excellent. All right, so I suppose I've been introduced. I am going to speak to you today about key building decarbonization strategies towards California climate goals. There is so much that California has been leading for there. So we have energy as well as GHG goals that would go towards those climate goals. So of course we should start here with the Warren-Alquist Act, which established the Energy Commission in 1974. So the Efficiency Division, which I believe a lot of people on this call are actually more familiar with because they do the rulemaking for the Title 24 Building Energy Efficiency Standards, as well as the Title 20 Appliance Standards. They, of course, do other policy implementation activities, work on program development and administration. So I did start out there, but then moved on to the Energy Assessments Division, where we take a more quantitative approach. We are responsible for the electricity, natural gas, and transportation energy demand forecasting, and distributed generation integration, grid reliability, and resource planning. We also do policy assessments and tracking analyses, and this is what I'd like to talk to you today about. So AB 32 was the California Global Warming Solutions Act, and the goal there was to reduce economy-wide GHG emissions to 1990 levels in 2020. So this aligned California with leading international governments and was the first step in some very clear climate legislation. AB 758 required the development of the existing buildings program, which is also housed in the Efficiency Division, and resulted in the triennial Existing Buildings Energy Efficiency Action Plan, which is now incorporated into the biennial California Energy Efficiency Action Plan. And I mention that because as we go here towards SB 350, which you also might be familiar with, the SB 350 requires the state to double statewide energy efficiency savings in electricity and natural gas end uses by 2030. So this is a future goal for us, and we have to track that progress. So that is actually reported in the Energy Efficiency Action Plan now. I have a set of slides at the end of this that I won't be speaking through, but it contains a lot of references to this legislation, websites or the pages on the Energy Commission website that are dealing with the implementation of these policies, as well as the assessment thereof. So I will be sharing that with the team. So SB 350 has this doubling of the energy efficiency. So where do we get what we might think that energy efficiency looks like in the future? Well, that's why Energy Assessments Division comes into the group. So we actually do the demand forecast for the state of California. So as part of that, we develop a forecast for projected energy efficiency savings. That's called AAEE, so for additional achievable energy efficiency, and it comes in many different scenarios. And one of those is a business as usual scenario, and then we can have others that are more aggressive. So in order to set the SB350 targets, we took that business as usual scenario and doubled it. That was published in the initial SB350 assessment in 2017. And that is the goal that we're still reaching towards. There was an additional assessment, it's always assessed every 2 years, in 2019 that we completed, and it showed us not quite meeting those goals. And perhaps part of that's not terrible, because perhaps our goals are becoming broader than just energy efficiency savings, but we're looking also at GHG reductions. So part of SB350 also looks at increasing the RPS standards, so that the website there is housed in renewables, but I thought that might also be interesting to folks, so I included that. So then AB32 got an upgrade with SB32, where the goal was increased to have economy-wide GHG emissions be 40% below 1990 levels in 2030. Then we have SB1383, which is an emissions guideline. So we want to reduce methane and HFCs by 40% below 2013 levels in 2030. And that's not something we've worked on very much. This has really been more in the CARB wheelhouse, but it is something that's going to affect the AB3232 assessment that I'd like to speak about more, because this has been the most recent project that our team has been working on. And we're getting ready to publish the AB3232 assessment soon. So I want to highlight that one. Of course, we have SB100. People are usually familiar with that one, where it does have a midterm goal there in 2030 of making the renewables supply be 60% of all retail electricity sales should be renewables. Then we had SB 1477 establishing the Build and Tech program. So we're looking at building electrification there, especially of water heating end uses. And then there's AB 3232, which I will speak about in more detail. The goal of AB 3232 is to reduce GHG emissions in residential and commercial building stock 40% below the levels in 1990. So this is not economy-wide. It's very focused on two portions of the building sector, residential and commercial. And then SB 49 is the most recent one here that has more action. And what SB 49 is doing is it extended the authority of the Energy Commission to not just set appliance energy efficiency standards, which the Efficiency Division has been doing for a long time, but to include cost-effective flexibility that supports electric grid reliability and existing demand response programs and policies. So those flexible demand appliance standards are going to help schedule, shift, and curtail energy use from one time of day to another. With consumer consent, appliances can then be better aligned to meet consumer and electric system demand. So this is something that's going to become very important if we electrify more, right? So as we add incremental electricity demand and reduce natural gas consumption, we will need to work on mitigating that effect on the grid. All right, so of course we have the longer term mid-century goals. That's usually where we think of SB 100 living. The goal there is to have 100% of all retail electricity sales to end use customers be from renewables and zero carbon resources. And we're going to hold state agencies to a higher standard there as well, and have 100% of electricity procured be from renewables and zero carbon resources as well. So the joint agencies, the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Air Resources Board are working on their first report. They'll be submitting a report every 4 years. The initial report should be coming out soon if it's not posted already. And there's quite a bit posted on the SB 100 page if you're interested in following that. And then we have the longest term goal here is that executive order in 2050, which is increasing the economy-wide GHG emissions goal to be 80% below 1990 levels. So now let's look at our AB 3232 assessment. So we worked very much with the Energy Efficiency Division here on this report, and the Energy Assessments Division did the technical analysis, analyzing the strategies that we considered in support of building decarbonization. So this was a working model that, of course, being a working model, evolves. And in our AB3232 analysis, we looked at 7 strategies that could support building decarbonization and did a first order analysis on each of those. So there are no interactive effects really considered here between each one of these individual strategies yet. The first strategy is natural gas energy efficiency. The second would be electric energy efficiency, which of course, it makes sense. We all understand that if we use less energy, we will emit less GHGs. Then we could have PV. The particular case we looked at here was distributed photovoltaics. This could be other distributed energy resources and batteries and that sort of thing. So in the final report, we will probably present it as such. This is simply the scenario that the Energy Assessment Division actually assessed this go around. So we looked at increasing penetrations of PVs and how that could, therefore having self-utilization, we would be pulling less from the grid, and of course it would be clean, and then we would have less GHG emissions. The fourth column here, or fourth pillar on the demand side, is fuel substitution. And in the report, we're moving away from the fuel substitution terminology and moving that to electrification, but can't completely get away from it since the tool we developed to assess building end use electrification is called the FSAT. So it's the Fuel Substitution Scenario Analysis Tool. And we specifically developed this tool for assessing the technical potential of the building end use electrification for new construction as well as existing buildings. Then if we look on the supply side, we can have renewable natural gas. So we could have natural gas that emits less GHGs. And of course, we can have a higher renewable penetration in the electric generation sector, which would also supply less emissions. Then we have the pillar of load flexibility, which a lot of people will talk about load flexibility as reducing GHG emissions, and it certainly can. But we actually are starting to think that this might play a much more important role in allowing electrification of a green grid. And these are all things we wouldn't have known without doing any of the work of the assessment. So you'll see hopefully why we might say some of those things. So if I'm looking here at this chart, we want to reduce the emissions in 2030, 40% below what they were in 1990. So first we needed to establish what the 1990 GHG emissions actually were. And that's what's done in this left-hand most column. The blue portion of the column are the emissions coming from the electric generation sector. The orange portion are those coming from natural gas combustion. The green block is from HFC leakage. So HFCs are the predominant refrigerants used, say, in heat pumps. So that ends up being important, especially as we consider fuel substitution in those end uses. That would then turn into heat pumps. So we have a small portion added. And then we have natural gas behind the meter leakage in the light blue. And we also include non-natural gas fuel consumption in the yellow, though we're not considering displacing it at this time, at least not in this initial report. So CARB released the estimates for 2018 values in 2020. That's our second column here. So that gives us a pretty good idea of where we're at right now. And then the third column is our business as usual projection as to where we would be if we don't change any policies. So if we don't make standards a whole lot more aggressive or don't have additional programs that might be focused on decarbonization. So what we can see is that there is about 5.5 million metric tons that we still need to reduce in order to meet the AB3232 goal. All right, so let me summarize the scenarios that we analyzed quantitatively for this. So the first two scenario rows here in pink and purple are the energy efficiency savings scenarios for gas and then for electric. So as I had mentioned before when we talked about SB 350, we have a forecast with various scenarios for additional achievable energy efficiency. And there is this middling forecast which looks at what our business as usual would be. But then we also have more aggressive or optimistic forecasts, where the scenario 5 actually meets and slightly exceeds the SB350 energy efficiency doubling goals. So what we looked at in these scenarios for decarbonization is how much that incremental added energy efficiency, whether it's gas or electric, how much more GHG reductions we could get from them. We did a similar thing for the yellow row for rooftop PV penetration, because we also have that as a forecast in as low penetration, mid penetration, which would be our business as usual, and a high penetration. So we looked at how an incremental addition to rooftop PV penetration would reduce GHG emissions further. So then on our supply side, we looked at renewable gas penetrations of anywhere from 15 to 20% of pipeline natural gas throughput by 2030. Our business as usual forecast currently does not include RNG, but we did this analysis as far as what if we did include RNG, how much GHG reduction would we get? And since biomethane is estimated to be sufficient to meet up to 15% of pipeline natural gas, any additional, so that additional 5% to get to 20% would be met by synthetic natural gas, which tends to be much more expensive. Then we have our fifth scenario in gray, where we had an accelerated RPS, or we're just incorporating more renewables into the grid. So instead of meeting the target of being 60% renewable in 2030, we're exceeding that, going to 65 to 70% renewables by 2030, and also adjusting our assumptions about the phase out of natural gas power plants and non-RPS imports from out of state. And this was run by our supply office through their production simulation Plexos modeling tool. And then, of course, we have our green row of 7 scenarios that we're presenting here today of various fuel substitution penetrations in new construction as well as existing buildings. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And then the last row here is load flexibility. We looked at load flexibility potential for major building fuel substitute end uses by 2030 in substituting for supply side battery storage and curbing renewable curtailment. So keeping more of the renewables in a greener grid and not adding the cost of battery storage by using load flexibility instead. So this is a high-level flow chart of our fuel substitution analysis tool. And what we did here is we built a tool that started with our natural gas demand forecast that's reported every 2 years in detail in the IPER. And we adjusted it by the business as usual energy efficiency savings. And then we disaggregated that from end use down to technologies. And that's using the same technology characterization that the CPUC uses in their potential and goal study. So once we had everything in the gas forecast broken down to actual gas technologies for the residential and commercial sector, we were able to then select electric technologies to substitute for those gas technologies. We would have at least one, if not several, technologies that we could substitute for each gas technology, and they would provide the same service to the end user. The output then would be the technology stock left in the final year of 2030, or I guess any interim year if you wanted that. Then, of course, importantly, the costs of those substitution efforts and the incremental electricity added by displacing gas with electricity. And then as far as meeting AB3232 goals, this is the entire reason we're doing this, we would calculate the net GHG emissions. There also was an hourly module because we needed that in order to assess grid impacts or potential grid impacts, especially of the higher electrification scenarios. All right, so here's a little bit more detail about the 7 scenarios that we are presenting. They all have 100% new construction penetration by 2030. The replace on burnout varied from a low percentage from 15% all the way up to 90%. Replace on burnout means, you know, if my heat pump, or sorry, that's not how this works, right? If my furnace burns out, right, then I say, okay, I'm not going to put another furnace in, but rather I'm going to put a heat pump in, right? So that would be a very reasonable way of approaching this with maybe outreach, education, programs could be developed and that sort of thing. Whereas for new construction, having 100% new construction, that's probably more of a rulemaking proceeding. So then if we look at early replacement, right, that would be saying, I don't want to burn gas anymore. I want to replace my functioning furnace with a heat pump, right? So that's a little harder to convince people to do because there is a cost there. So we had lower percentages here and higher, and going from 5% for most of the scenarios. And we'll see that the lowest scenario, we chose that one because it was the lowest one that met the AB3232 goals. So then as far as technology efficiency, I mentioned we had various options for the efficiency levels of the electric technologies that we would replace the gas technology by. And we could either have a flat distribution where each technology was chosen at an equal rate, or we could skew this to choosing higher efficiency technologies more often than not. And if one had an incentive program, that would be a very realistic way of approaching this. So then the last column is the SB 1383 goals. And at the time when we first started developing this tool in 2019, we didn't have a lot of data on what that might look like. And we're just starting to get that information. And then maybe we can work with CARB and see how some of those goals might be met and what cost those could have, because we really are trying to assess the different decarbonization strategies, not just on meeting the goal, but what it takes to get there, right, on a cost per ton, so $1 per ton rate. So it is interesting to say that if we did have the SB 1383 goals completely met, then we could actually meet the AB 3232 target without fuel substitution. Or if we had those met and we had scenario 8, then we would get 50% below the goals. So we'll see that here in our GHG impacts. So we're looking at clusters for each of the decarbonization strategies. And this shows the percentage of GHG reduction from 1990 values that we would project from those strategies, in our what if world, our hypothetical, technical, potential type world, without any market forces or economics or anything like that, how close can we get to those goals? And what we see on the left-hand side is energy efficiency savings are unfortunately not quite enough to reach the 40% target. Same for PV, the accelerated RPS, the black column, gets close, right? Fuel substitution or building end-use electrification certainly meets that goal, and for some scenarios can far exceed it. And then the other set of strategies that meets the goal is renewable natural gas. Okay, so if we have that, we can also break this out a little bit as to where those GHG emissions are coming from. And so the left-hand cluster of columns is pretty much the same thing that I showed you before. Then we have the scenarios 1 through 12 here, and you can see that the scenario 4A meets the goals. That was one of the renewable gas scenarios. The blue column for electric generation is the same size as the 2030 baseline, right, as a business as usual projection. And that makes sense because we're not changing anything there. We're just cleaning up the gas supply. So then scenario 5 would be adding more renewables to electric generation. And we can see there that that blue bar is shorter than it would be if we didn't, which makes sense. And then if we look at scenarios 6 through 12, which are electrification scenarios, we can see that the blue bar also grows a little bit. And that's simply because we have added incremental electricity as we reduce gas consumption. So as the blue bar grows a bit, the orange bar shrinks more. So we are actually having overall GHG reductions, which is the intention of this fuel substitution effort in our what if hypothetical world. So it's you can see that scenario 6 meets the AB3232 goals. Scenario 12 actually gets down to 50% below 1990. And let's move on to costs and cost effectiveness. So we need to do a little bit of shift in thinking, right? All of our physical impacts are occurring from now to 2030. And that's our 2030 is our actual goal for AB 3232. And we need to make sure that we meet that target, right? We want to see what do we need to do in order to meet that target. But any efforts that we make in 2029 and 2023, we will still reap benefits from those for the entire time that the technology is installed. So if I'm going back to my furnace, right, and my furnace burns out in 2030. So I go, okay, this is my opportunity to purchase a heat pump. So I do that, but I incur all of the costs in 2030. But I reap benefits all the way out to 2045, assuming a useful lifetime of 15 years for that heat pump. So if I really want to compare, cost per ton of GHG reduction, I might want to consider the impacts and the costs of each of those scenarios based on interventions from 2020 to 2030, but spread them over the entire impact time horizon out to 2045. So that's what we've done here. So I would encourage you to look only at the right-hand column right now. These are all the same scenarios that we've been presenting. But what we can see on the right-hand column is that energy efficiency, unsurprisingly, has a negative cost. So you're also saving money over the lifetime of the equipment by doing energy efficiency, right? It's very cost effective. That seems reasonable. Same thing for PV, right? The cost dollar per ton is negative. So unfortunately, those didn't meet the 40% GHG reduction goal. But if I look at the orange RNG scenarios, those got close. Now, again, looking at the very right-hand column, they're expensive, I'm told, right? It's $343 per ton up to $402 per ton. But if we compare that to our fuel substitution or electrification scenarios in green, right, those still have positive costs. They're not free. There is a cost for reducing GHGs, but it's much smaller, right? So we go from $39 per ton up to $140, and the $39 per ton scenario actually meets our AB 3232 goals. So these are all things for policymakers to consider. Another last item that I want to share with you are some ideas and insights about energy system impacts and grid implications. So of course, as we're displacing gas, we want to provide the same service to end users. So we are adding incremental electricity. And that's not insignificant, especially as we get to the higher energy efficiency scenarios here on the very right-hand side with scenario 12. So the penultimate column on the right-hand side. So I compared that to the actual baseline consumption in 2030. So for the residential sector, and those columns for the residential sector are higher because the consumption of natural gas is simply much higher. So there's a lot more fuel substitution that can occur there. So for that very high penetration of fuel substitution, in scenario 12, we actually would be adding 40% of the baseline electricity consumption because of fuel substitution in 2030. So we would have to think about how to deal with that demand and provide for it, right? So what we also looked at is, well, what if we use the most efficient technologies? Not just skewing it, but only using the most efficient technology. And that was really interesting because that's what provided the single or the most right-hand column. And so for very high penetrations, we were able to reduce the added incremental electricity due to the electrification effort from 40% to 31% of baseline energy consumption there. So that's also something to consider. That really efficient electrification is very, very important. All right, so last piece here, we need to consider on an hourly basis as to when we require that added electricity as well. Where is that demand increasing? And we can't see that full impact of added energy system loads resulting from fuel substitution efforts unless we assess when those occur as measured against the baseline loads. So we have seasonal peak loads shown here for Northern California, as you know, PG&E being a proxy for Northern California, and SCE and SDG&E being a proxy for the Southern California. And we can see that in 2030, for the very high penetration fuel substitution scenario, the fuel substitution efforts certainly increase peak loads. So the increase is the red portion of the column. And the winter loads are actually affected more than summer loads. So that would make sense if we're considering space heating, right? That was usually a furnace, but now I have a heat pump. And also, if we're considering about when we need that energy, the peak incremental fuel substitution additions are not coincident with managed peak load dates, meaning they don't happen at the same time, same day or time, as they would have occurred without electrification. So what?
Ingrid, I just want to let you know that you're at 11:01. So
okay, I'm almost there. So close.
I got you.
Cool. All right. So basically, what we're not really worried about the day necessarily changing, right? That's something that could be accommodated for. But what's very interesting to see, and I've noted here, is that the times are changing. So the peak loads are actually being shifted from early evening hours to morning hours. So that's again indicative of that added electrified space heating during the winter. The summer peak loads are not shifted in the same way. All right, so this was the last slide I promised that we had for load flexibility. We defined load flexibility as load shift using the CPUC's definition for this analysis. We constrained load shifting to be 20% of end-use demand, and we only used additional load shift potential of fuel substitution for the newly electrified end uses. So that would be HVAC and water heating. We didn't include appliances. We didn't think that that was something that could be automatically shifted. There's too much of a behavioral component there. So we did a very conservative estimate using the same, that was consistent with LBNL's demand response potential study that was released in the summer of 2020 and the pathway study completed by E3. And what we found were these gigawatt hours per shift event, and we did find a nominal amount of GHG reduction, but are starting to think that the true value of load shift really lies in mitigating, adding more battery storage as we electrify, and also reducing generation curtailment. So the efficiency division is also working on the 2020 load management rulemaking. So I've included that link. And that proceeding, the goal of that proceeding is to form the foundation for a statewide system that automates the creation of hourly and sub-hourly costs or signals that can be used by end-use automation to provide real-time demand flexibility on the grid. So they are working very closely with the folks in the appliance office on SB 49. And all these efforts will very much support any future electrification of a green grid. So I'm done.
Well done, Ingrid. Okay, that is a very optimistic and interesting presentation.